Okay, so you want to own a Roman fortress. 25 hectares of stone walls on a hill in the provinces. 5,000 trained men who answer to you. Granaries stacked to the rafters. A bathhouse steaming day and night. Workshops turning out swords. And a whole town of merchants growing up outside your gates paying you for the privilege. It looks like the ultimate hard asset. A private city that prints power, protects trade routes, and makes its owner one of the most important men on the frontier. Here's the problem. A Roman fortress was never an asset. It was the single most expensive thing the Roman state built anywhere, and almost nobody who ran one owned it in any way that let them keep the profit. What you were actually signing up for was a machine that ate grain, timber, silver, and human labor at a rate that could bankrupt a small kingdom, and that produced, on paper, nothing you could sell. So let's take this apart the way a Roman quartermaster actually had to see it, not the way it looks on a museum model behind glass. First, a quick note on what kind of fortress we're even talking about, because the size changes everything about how the economics behave. There were marching camps, thrown up in an afternoon and abandoned by morning. There were small auxiliary forts holding a few hundred border troops. There were the great supply depots on the rivers. But the purest version of this thing, the one where the cost is almost unimaginable, is the permanent legionary fortress, the castra of a full legion. That's the version we're breaking down, because that's where the numbers get genuinely frightening in both directions. And to understand the scale, sit with one figure for a second. In the early empire, military spending swallowed somewhere around 70 to 75% of the entire Roman state budget. Not defense as one line item among many. Defense as almost the whole thing. Everything else Rome is famous for. The roads, the aqueducts, the grain dole for the city mob, the temples, all of it split whatever was left after the army was paid. The army was the state's expense. A fortress was where that expense physically lived. Let's start with the part nobody thinks about first. The ground underneath the walls. A fortress doesn't begin with a wall. It begins with a decision about where, and that decision alone could doom the whole project. The Romans didn't build where it was pretty. They built where a river was navigable, where a road could cross, where a hill gave them height over hostile tribes. Take Deva, the fortress that became the modern city of Chester in Britain. It was planted on a sandstone bluff over a bend in the River Dee, specifically because ships could sail right up to it, and because the bend guarded two sides for free. Get that choice wrong, and everything downstream costs more forever. Build too far from a navigable river, and every single ton of grain has to come overland by ox cart, which was so slow and so expensive that moving grain 100 miles by land could double its price. Build too close to the enemy, with no natural defense, and you pay for it in blood instead of silver. So before a single stone is cut, you are already choosing between expensive problems. Pay in engineering to tame a difficult site, or pay forever in supply costs for an easy one. Now here's where it gets interesting. Say you've got your site. You've got your river, your road, your hill. Now you have to build. And building a legionary fortress is nothing like building a villa. Deva covered around 25 hectares. That's over 60 acres of walls, barracks, headquarters, granaries, workshops, a hospital, and a bath complex, all laid out in the famous playing card rectangle. And the first version went up fast, in timber, because timber was quick. Archaeologists estimate the first phase of Deva alone consumed roughly 24,000 tons of timber, just for the fortress. The harbor and the amphitheater outside it needed another 30,000 tons on top of that. Whole forests, felled, hauled, and shaped by hand, but timber rots. So within a generation, the Romans did what they always did. They rebuilt in stone, and this is where the cost stops being large and becomes almost absurd. The stone walls at Deva were rebuilt using an estimated 55,000 tons of stone for the defenses alone. And then, when the fortress was upgraded again in the 3rd century under Septimius Severus, the estimate for the stone used climbs to something like 300,000 tons. 300,000 tons of sandstone, every block quarried across the river, dressed by hand, and hauled into place without a single machine. There's a reason the walls of these fortresses survived long enough to become the medieval walls of European cities. They were built like the state that made them expected to last forever. And here's the trap that no modern developer would recognize, but every Roman commander understood in his bones. The men who built the fortress were the men who would live in it. The legion built its own base. So the construction cost wasn't a check written to a contractor. It was months, sometimes years, of your own trained soldiers swinging picks instead of drilling for war. Every day a legionary spent cutting stone was a day he wasn't a soldier. The labor was free in the sense that you were paying it anyway, and ruinously expensive in the sense that it was the most valuable labor in the entire empire being spent on masonry. That's the first hidden cost. The fortress was built by an army that stopped being an army to build it. Now, let's talk about the part everybody assumes is simple, where the money actually went. Most people picture a fortress and think about walls, but the walls were the cheap part. The walls were a one-time cost. The thing that ate silver every single day, forever, was the men. This is where the whole economics live. A legion at full strength was roughly 5,000 men, and every one of them was paid. In the early empire, a common legionary earned around 225 denarii a year. That sounds small until you multiply it, and until you remember it was only the floor. Officers earned multiples of the base pay. A centurion could earn 15 or more times a common soldier's wage, and the senior centurions, the primi ordines, earned dozens of times more. Stack the whole pyramid together, and a single legion's annual payroll ran into the millions of sesterces, year after year, war or no war, whether they fought a single battle or sat behind the walls playing dice. And pay only ever went one direction, up. It stayed flat at that 225 figure for over a century, and then the emperors started buying loyalty with raises. Domitian pushed it to 300. Septimius Severus took it to around 450. His son Caracalla, who famously said the only people worth keeping happy were the soldiers, shoved it to 675. In the space of a few decades, the single largest cost of owning a fortress tripled, and no emperor who valued his own life dared cut it back down. This is the ancient version of a cost that only ratchets upward, and it's a big part of what eventually helped wreck the Roman currency itself. Because when you can't cut army pay, and you can't raise enough tax, the last option is to quietly put less silver in every coin. Which they did, again and again, until the denarius was mostly base metal. So now you're not just feeding a fortress, you're feeding a wage bill that grows on its own and can never shrink. Which brings us to the actual feeding. An army, the saying goes, marches on its stomach, and a garrison eats even when it's standing still. Each legionary needed somewhere around 800 grams of grain a day, mostly wheat, ground into bread and porridge. Do the arithmetic on that, and a single soldier is eating roughly a third of a ton of grain a year. Multiply by 5,000 men in one fortress, and you're looking at well over 1,500 tons of grain a year flowing into a single base, just for the soldiers, before you feed the officers' households, the servants, the animals, and the town outside. By one estimate, the Roman garrison across all of Britain was consuming something like 30 tons of grain every single day. That grain didn't appear. It was pulled out of the countryside through a system called the annona militaris, a supply network of requisition and tax in kind that reached across provinces, and it all had to be physically moved, stored, and protected from rot, damp, and rats. Which is why one of the most important buildings inside any fortress wasn't the headquarters or the temple, it was the granary, the horea, and the granary tells you everything about how seriously the Romans took the terror of an empty storehouse. These were engineering marvels built to fight a war against spoilage. Raised floors on rows of little pillars so air could flow underneath and keep the grain dry. Thick buttressed walls to take the outward pressure of tons of loose grain. Ventilation slots, careful drainage. A well-run fortress aimed to keep something like a year's supply of grain in reserve at all times. Because the one thing more dangerous than a besieging enemy was an empty granary in February. A fortress that ran out of food didn't lose a battle. It simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. So the granary was the real heart of the machine, and keeping it full was a permanent, grinding, year-round cost that never took a day off. Now let's talk about a cost almost nobody thinks to ask about: heat and water. Because a Roman fortress wasn't a grim barracks. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, a small luxury city, and luxury has a fuel bill. Take the baths. Deva had a bath complex the size of a modern sports hall, and it ran on a hypocaust, an underfloor heating system where furnaces pushed hot air beneath raised floors and up through the walls. It's genuinely brilliant engineering. It's also a furnace that had to be fed constantly, and those furnaces burned several tons of wood every single day just to keep one bath complex hot. The baths at Deva are estimated to have run through something like 850,000 liters of water a day, piped in from springs over a mile away through lead pipes and an aqueduct. And that's on top of the water for 5,000 men, their horses, their kitchens, and their latrines, which the Romans flushed with constantly running water. One estimate puts Deva's total water demand at over 2 million liters a day. Every day. Forever. Fuel and water sound free until you realize that keeping a fortress warm and clean quietly deforested the surrounding hills and required a permanent hydraulic system that could fail and leave thousands of men with nothing to drink. So layer all of this together, the soldiers' pay that only ever rises, the grain that flows in by the ton and must be guarded from rot, the timber and stone, the fuel, the water, the animals, the leather, the iron for weapons, the salt, the wine, the doctors in the hospital, the clerks in the headquarters keeping records on wooden tablets. A legionary fortress wasn't a building that sat quietly holding its value. It was a mouth, a vast, permanent mouth that consumed a measurable fraction of an entire empire's economy and produced, in strict accounting terms, nothing. No crop, no product, no trade good you could put on a ship and sell. So why build it? Why would anyone pour that much of a civilization's wealth into a thing that only ever costs? And this is where you have to stop thinking like an accountant and start thinking like an emperor. Because the fortress did produce something. It just wasn't something you could weigh. It produced security. It produced tax collection, because a pacified province pays, and a fortress is what pacifies it. It produced trade, because the roads the army built and guarded carried merchants, and the wages of 5,000 well-paid soldiers flowed straight into the town outside the walls, the Canabe, where wine sellers and blacksmiths and every other kind of trader grew rich, serving the garrison. The fortress didn't turn a profit. It made profit possible for everyone around it. It was infrastructure disguised as a barracks. The return on a fortress was an entire functioning province, and you can't put that in a granary. But that only works if the math underneath it holds. And here's the number that decided whether any of it survived. It's the same brutal principle that governs any operation with enormous fixed costs. Almost every cost of a fortress was fixed and did not care whether the frontier was quiet or on fire. The wall cost the same to man, whether the enemy came or not. The 5,000 men had to be paid and fed whether they fought a great war or sat idle for a decade of peace. Peace didn't make a fortress cheaper. Peace just meant you were paying full price for an army that wasn't doing anything visible, which is exactly when politicians back in Rome started asking why they were spending so much on soldiers who never fought. And the moment they cut the spending, or debased the coin so the soldiers' pay was worth less, or let the granaries run low to save money, the whole machine started to wobble. A fortress running at full readiness felt safe. But full readiness was ruinously expensive, and the temptation to skimp during quiet years was exactly how frontiers rotted from the inside long before any barbarian showed up. Now put two very different frontier stories side by side, because they show the trap perfectly. Consider the fortress that was maintained. Deva stood, garrisoned and supplied, for well over 3 centuries. It got rebuilt in stone, upgraded again and again, kept full of grain and men, and because it was maintained, the town outside it never died. When the legions finally left Britain around the beginning of the 5th century, the fortress didn't vanish. The civilians kept using its walls for protection, and that settlement became the city of Chester, which is still there today, 17 centuries later, its medieval walls literally sitting on Roman foundations. That is a fortress that paid off, over a timescale no investor could ever wait for. Not in coin, in continuity. Now consider what happened when the supply stopped. Because the thing that actually killed Roman fortresses was almost never a heroic siege. It was the silver drying up. By the later empire, the currency was so debased that soldiers increasingly had to be paid in grain and goods rather than reliable coin. And when the central state could no longer guarantee that the annona would arrive, when the pay was worthless and the granaries went unfilled, the garrisons simply melted away. The records tell the story quietly. A document from around the end of the 4th century, the Notitia Dignitatum, lists the military units of the empire, and Deva isn't in it. No dramatic last stand. The soldiers just weren't there anymore. They'd drifted off, or never been replaced, because the money to hold them had run out. A fortress didn't fall, it defaulted. The state stopped paying the operating costs, and the most expensive military infrastructure in the ancient world switched off like an unpaid utility. And that's the structural lesson hiding in both stories. A fortress was never a one-time purchase. It was a permanent subscription. The stone walls could stand for 1,000 years, but the fortress only stayed alive as long as somebody, somewhere, kept paying the grain and the silver, year after year, with no end date. The walls were the cheap, easy, one-time part. The endless operating cost was the real thing you were buying, and the moment you stopped being able to afford it, the most impressive walls in the world became nothing but an empty stone shell for a later people to live inside. So let's run both endings honestly, the way the Roman treasury actually had to. Here's the optimistic version. Your fortress holds a rich, pacified province. The garrison keeps the peace, so the taxes flow in reliably. The soldiers' wages pour into the town outside, which grows fat and busy and generates trade and yet more tax. The roads your men built carry commerce in every direction. On this math, the fortress is one of the best investments a state ever made, because the entire economic output of a secured province is the return, and that return compounds for centuries. Chester is the receipt, and here's the realistic version. A plague thins the population, so the tax base shrinks just as the army pay ratchets up again to keep the soldiers loyal. To close the gap, the emperors debase the coin, which spikes prices, which means the soldiers demand another raise, which means more debasement. The granaries, quietly underfunded during a decade of peace, are running low. A rival emperor pulls half your garrison off to fight a civil war, and they never fully come back. Suddenly the fixed cost of the fortress hasn't changed at all, but the state's ability to pay it has collapsed, and there is no version of a fortress that runs on half its grain and a third of its silver. The difference between the good century and the bad one wasn't the walls. The walls were identical. It was whether the invisible river of grain and coin kept flowing, and that river depended on 100 things happening far away that no fortress commander could control. That's the whole thing in one idea. A Roman fortress was not a building. It was two economies stacked on top of each other. One where a secured, tax-paying province pays for its own defense many times over, and one where the cost of the garrison outruns the wealth it's supposed to protect. And the only thing separating them was a steady supply line and a stable coin, the two most fragile things in the entire Roman world. So, could owning a Roman fortress make you powerful? Absolutely. It could make you the master of a province and a maker of emperors. But it could never make you rich the way a farm or a mine or a trading fleet made you rich, because a fortress didn't produce wealth. It consumed wealth and produced order, and order is only valuable as long as you can keep paying for it. The emperors who understood this kept the granaries full, kept the coin honest as long as they could, and treated the frontier as a permanent bill rather than a prize. The ones who tried to squeeze it, who skimped on grain and watered down the silver to make the numbers work for one more year, got a few quiet years and then a frontier that dissolved without a fight. A fortress isn't a stronghold you own, it's a promise you have to keep funding, and the walls, however mighty, were always the least important part of the deal.